Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where we can be, belong, and become the very best version of ourselves. And so, as always, we want to ask that you consider clicking that little subscribe button, continue to support what we're doing. We love doing what we do. And what we do is we deconstruct, we reconstruct, we look at the Bible in responsible ways. And so every time we delve into a chapter or a book or even like a psalm, whatever it is that we're moving through, we always ask the important questions of context. Who is the author? Who is the audience? Right? What is the original language? How does it affect our understanding? We'll look at different interpretations from first century all the way until now. We do all of this really difficult research so that you can understand it so much clearer and make applications for today. And so we do all of that because we believe that the Bible is filled with really beautiful, beautiful concepts of how to be a better human, how to navigate the world better with the divine in yourself and your community. We believe it all affects how we live. And so, being someone who has moved through these passages myself, I am so excited every week to share with you something new, or maybe even just an idea that maybe you've already heard before, but we kind of put a little twist on it. And so, again, thank you so much for joining us today. So, before we step into Genesis chapter 10, I want to take one of the questions I was given just a couple weeks ago. I'm getting around to answering some of them, but here's one of them that came up. Were Abraham and other Israelite forefathers real people, or are they all just made up characters in Israel's narrative? So that's a really good question, right? And oftentimes, the kind of work we do, deconstruction, looking deeper at the Bible, understanding some of the deeper significance of how the people wrote and why they wrote. These kind of questions will ultimately come up, and sometimes they have the effect of really hurting someone's belief in the beauty of the Bible. Sometimes even questioning if there's something bigger than themselves, the divine God. This happens, right? And so my answer is going to be a little bit broad at first, and so just kind of bear with me. Um, I think it's really important first and foremost to remind us the reason the Bible is being written was not for historical purposes. It was not to remind Israel these are the exact dates and times. This is how long people literally lived. That was not the intention of writing Torah. So, again, the intention of writing Torah was first and foremost for them to keep their identity as a people. And so, how do you keep your identity? Some of us would say you keep the recipes, right? The food recipes grandma made. Others of us would say we retell some of the stories, right? And so, these stories are not always, if we're thinking about our own familial kind of family structures, right? These stories are not always literal, are they? Sometimes they do get bigger and bigger with age, with time, right? And so this is the idea here that most Hebrew rabbis, um, pre first century, whenever they would discuss the Bible, it was never about literal history. Very rarely did any rabbis have that view. The idea was to look back over their stories, over their narratives, over their poetry, their epic stories. Right? It was always to inform them so they can understand their present better, to not repeat cycles. And so the idea again of it being history, it just kind of falls flat when we understand how the people who wrote it viewed it, right? And so when I get at this question of was Abraham a real person or not, I will clearly and honestly say I don't know. Right? I don't know. I have some guesses. I have some jumps to conclusions on my own that I've made, and other rabbis have made the same. But I think it's pretty safe to say Abraham. Even the name Abraham means like this father, this great patriarch. Right, the name itself has those connotations. So if I was talking about a great patriarch in a language of my own, I would use the word patriarch. For Hebrew people, they would use the word Abraham, right? So you kind of see where I'm going with this. But was there an actual person who was the founder of Israel who stepped away from his father's tribe, right? His father's occupation, left idol worship. There's this interesting story when you begin reading some of the other secondary sources of the Jewish canon. You'll read this interesting story about Abraham and his father. There's this fascinating moment in the story where Abraham is supposed to go to his father's workplace. And his father is actually, and we can see this throughout scripture, there's a couple references, but I kind of have to dig for it, where it says his father was an idol maker. And so the story, whether it's true or not, whether it's been added over years, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. But the story is Abraham, or again, the father of Israel, the nation Israel, which is a pretty young nation when you look at the history of nations, right? It shows up later, after the Assyrians, after the Babylonians, or I should say, just pre-Babylon. But what you have here is Abraham sees his father selling idols. His father decides to step away for a time, which in that tradition would say he's going to give his son his business, turn it over. Abraham, the story goes, he's trying to sell the idols, and one of them breaks, one of them falls. And the story goes, Abraham looks at the idol that's been broken, and he expects the worst. This God is now going to smite him. There's going to be some kind of repercussions for the carelessness that Abraham had. But Abraham waits, and he waits. Nothing happens. And so what Abraham does, the story goes, he goes over and taps another one, looks around, nothing. And he begins just dropping them all. He realizes in that moment, the story goes, that his father's gods, they're weak, they're worthless, they are powerless. And so Abraham chooses to not only walk away from his father's trade, he chooses to walk away from his tribe. That's so heavy. And so think about Israel, like the very beginning, the foundation of who Israel is as a nation. It starts with this departure from the norm, right? A departure from what the commonplace of the day, right? The idea of this polytheistic culture where they have many gods to a monotheistic one. This is a departure from the norm. Israel is not a normal empire, right? Israel is not a normal nation. They step away. And so these stories, they're filled with so much beauty, but they're always a reference, a direct connection to who Israel is, who they aren't. Did Abraham literally do all of those things? I don't know. Was his name literally Abraham, father of the nations? I don't know, right? All I can tell you is the story was told for a reason. I tend to kind of believe that there was probably a guy who stepped away from his nation and started this new one. Was his name Abraham again? I don't know. I tend to have these beliefs that I think maybe there was a guy who pulled his nation and got them excited about their identity again, and they stepped away from Egypt. I think there were these people. Did they do some of these heroic things? Were they as big? Again, I don't know, right? But all I can tell you is the reason behind it is what's most important. Whether they were or weren't, don't lose sight of the message. Because I think once we get caught up in arguing over was Moses a real prince of Egypt, which again would have been very highly unlikely, or not, I don't know. All I can tell you is there's a deeper message for Israel. We need to call out to God. We need to step away from what enslaves us. We need to wander the desert. We need to relearn and learn new things, right? We need to break old cycles and start new ritual, ones that bring life. All of this has deep meaning for Israel. And so maybe not, but don't lose sight of it. Don't get caught up in the arguments. I would argue those are such superfluous arguments. End of the day, the beauty is in the intention of the author. And it's always to remind the people where we've been, where we're going. Don't forget who you are, Israel. Good, right? Okay. So I hope that answered your question to some degree. Please keep those questions coming. I love reading those questions. I won't always have great answers, but I can always direct us to places that do if I don't. And so everyone, thank you so much for sending those in. Now, let's get into Genesis. So again, Genesis, after all of what I just said, one more reminder, written Torah is compiled in Babylonian captivity, 587 BC. right? And as we just talked about, Torah is a response to the fears of assimilation, especially Genesis. It's written on the scroll there: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It is poetry, song, mythology, warnings, all of that. And so it is Torah is basically Israel miniaturized through every single telling. And it's beautiful. And so today's a tough one. Most pastors, most scholars, even rabbis will often skip chapter 10 because on the surface, chapter 10 is kind of a bore. It's kind of this chapter that it just kind of drags. It's just a bunch of names, right? And so the beauty of this is, though, I just want to show you a little bit of some beauty that I find in even chapter 10. Again, Genesis is filled with so much beauty, so much purpose to it. There's a reason for every chapter. And so I'll share that. One more reminder: Noah. Remember this as we delve into chapter 10. Noah is, again, a name, first off, that connotates this idea of rest. The moment where you breathe, you gather your thoughts, you pull in your courage before you step into the storm. That's Noah, right? And so chapter 10, it starts off with a bunch of names, right? It's the best way I can describe it. Open up your Bibles, chapter 10. As you read through, you're going to just see lots and lots of names, right? Father of, son of, your Babylon, Assyria, Canaan. You're going to see Shem, Ham, Japheth, all brought up again. But no real stories connected to it, just names and who begot who, right? And so you'll kind of see this, but here's a reminder for ancient people. Again, they're not putting together their family tree in order to say, great great grandpa, he was a bricklayer, and great great grandmother, she made really good bread. That wasn't the point, right? Genealogies for ancient Israelite people and most ancient Israelite or ancient empires, right? Genealogies, the idea behind them was to say, here's where our enemies came from, right? And so if you're going to talk about your enemies, these dreaded evil people, you're going to give them a really bad beginning, right? They're going to come from the curses. Whenever your country hurt or was in sorrow, it was the enemy, right? And so you'll see this as you kind of read through some of the names and ideas. They're not giving you literal history. They're essentially saying, look, here are the different points. Here are the different points of who we are, who we weren't. Here's where we think our enemies are like, right? Here are the values they held onto, and here are the ones we held onto. They went down the path of brokenness. Israel followed the way of life. Even though there are moments where they kind of turn and go up and down, that's the genealogy, the idea of genealogies, not to be taken as literal history, right? And you can even see that when you look at the New Testament with Jesus, right? You have these two very different gospels that give very different genealogies of Jesus. And again, not to be taken literally, the idea of the genealogy was to say more about Israel, more about the deeper ideas of where they're going, where they've been, the cycles, right, that have been broken, where the enemy has gone and where Israel has gone. Let's continue Israel moving toward life. So again, genealogies are really all about that. And so this chapter, again, long lists of names. It's a story of the past connecting. It is what we call a bridge. So again, interesting bridge here, right? Think about a bridge. A bridge is going to connect you from one place to another, right? Very simple. When you think of like a story, right? A story is a bridge. And so if you look at the story of The Hobbit. Yeah, let's look at The Hobbit. The Hobbit, Mr. Frodo, or Lord of the Rings or whatever, Mr. Frodo will leave home. And then he ends up coming back home, and then eventually he'll end up other places. But he takes this big journey. He crosses over the bridge. The main meat of the story, the majority of the story, is not the beginning or the end, right? It's all about the journey. The meat of the story, the bulk of the story, the interesting part of the story is always in between, right? It's always the stuff that happens in between. And so think of this chapter is kind of this bridge that's going to link different individuals to Israel. It's going to kind of give us a deeper, broader perspective. And so think about the bridge like this picture. You have all these different characters that are going to show up. And so this chapter is kind of the bridge that these characters are going to walk, right? It kind of gives the outline of like, here's this and this and this and this. And we will see in the next 10, 15 chapters, we're going to see how these individuals walked the bridge, right? We're going to see how these individuals move and change and shift. We're going to watch as these different individuals make poor decisions and all of it, but the framework has been laid, right? And so what chapter 10 does is it takes the past and it connects it to the future, and it gives the two an ability to kind of walk straight, right? Walk on the bridge. It's going to give us the structure. And so as you read chapter 10, and again, I would argue if I just read all the names, you would probably fall asleep on your couch. But here's what I want to do. I'm just going to connect a couple of them here and there. And please read it over yourself later, but understand it from this perspective, and it'll make sense. You've got someone like Nimrod, right? Nimrod, he is going to be the father of Babylon, right? And so he's going to be, one first century rabbi says this, Nimrod caused the entire world to rebel against the Holy One. So if you are Israel and you've just been taken captive, right, by Babylon, then you might remember this story, this bridge, this connection. No wonder Babylon does this, because it always has. Its very founder, right? The person who has started Babylon has always been one who causes the entire world to rebel against what is good. So again, it says more about Babylon than it does about their actual beginnings. Interesting, right? And every time you pick up any of the stories or ideas about Babylon, even the word means chaos, right? And we'll see in chapter 11, we'll delve more into this idea of chaos. But what the authors are trying to say is not Babylon literally began this way. It's that everywhere Babylon goes, chaos follows. Brokenness follows. And where does Babylon? It's east, right? So every time we see an empire moving east, settling east, we know there's going to be chaos, brokenness. It's where our enemies always bring chaos, brokenness. That's what Israel's saying. Israel's the empire that brings peace, or supposed to, right? Wholeness, shalom, tikkun olam, right? Their enemies bring chaos, brokenness, disrepair. Another one, Ashur, right? He is the father of Nineveh. And it's fascinating to look at this one. This is the father of Nineveh. And one of the rabbis say this about him. He began by distancing himself and people from Babylon. So the idea here, because Nineveh used to be a thriving place for a while, and they knew this. And so how would you talk about a place, a great nation that essentially lost their way? Well, for a while, they distanced themselves from the chaos, but at some point, they began to move toward the chaos, and they created what he calls a legacy befell on them, a legacy of chaos, brokenness, right? Disrepair. So that's how they describe Nineveh, which again, fascinating stuff. If you study into Nineveh, you won't find this apart from the Israelite narrative. You just won't. But that's how they describe it, the actual name even meaning this father of Nineveh, right? The great city port with the fish, right? That's the idea there. Another one. This one, again, the Philistines. You've heard about the Philistines, right? You've heard about Goliath, right? And David, how he slew Goliath. Well, where did those Philistines come from? There's a whole story about that we'll read. But this is the setup. This is the bridge. And so Pathrusim, Kazluhim, these two individuals, they're called the fathers of the Philistines. And notice this, the Philistines, descended from them both for the, and I'm not even going to try to, Pathrusim and Kasluhim exchanged the intimacy of their wives with each other, and the Philistines descended from them. So again, this is not literal genealogy, but this is describing the kind of things. This is why our enemies are so chaotic. This is why they search for blood, right? These are the stories they told around the campfires about their enemies. And some of you know this, right? Think about growing up, right? Growing up, you had that old man that lived down the street. And before you know it, the stories got bigger and bigger, right? The old man, he probably has a basement. And down in the basement, what do you suppose is in the basement? Well, I mean, there's probably bones. There's probably all kinds of crazy things, monsters, whatever. And before you know it, the old man who lives down the street in the large house, he's become a vampire, right? And he comes out at night and he hunts children. Before you know it, the whole story gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, where was the truth of it? I don't know. But it says more about the old man and his actions and the people who made up the stories than it does actually about the old man. Make sense? Yeah. So do we know that literally this is the Philistines came about because the intimacy with the wives of each other? Well, no, but these are the stories they told, right? It's their histories, right? It's literally this picture here. The old man that sits around and he tells the stories. He tells the stories to the kids that we'll sit together around the holidays, and the patriarchs, the matriarchs, they will come together and they'll tell the younger generations these stories, right? And again, it's not that they're attempting to deceive, not at all. They're telling them, the kids, what life was like, but they don't always give us the full picture, do they? Because they're stories, right? And oftentimes the stories are told for a specific reason, right? To remind us our family's strong, right? To remind us we don't give up, right? To remind us our family did this, and this is why you should do this and this. You see where I'm going with this? It's the bridge. They're building us frameworks in which we can walk into the future too. And so my own family, it reminds me of my own family in so many beautiful ways. My grandfather on my mom's side, actually he and my grandmother, they both had 5 kids each. And my grandfather's wife died of cancer. And my grandmother, her husband died. And so these two individuals, strong farmers in the area, their significant others die at very close times. And so these two met and they fell in love and they decided we're going to raise our kids. It's like the Brady Bunch, right, on a farm, the Brady farm. And so these two come together. And what my grandparents built is beautiful. My grandmother is very old right now. She's in her upper 80s, and she is still in a position of power there in Eaton Rapids. She's I can't remember the exact position. She's on the city council. She's been voted in every year. She's such a thriving person. She just doesn't give up. She fights tooth and nail. There's a story. My grandparents, they were farmers, and the farmers during that time, 1985, they were being mistreated by the government. And all these regulations and rules were really hurting local farming. And so my grandparents, they joined with Farm Aid. And my grandpa, it's a beautiful story. I remember hearing it around the Thanksgiving table. My grandpa said he and his friends, they got hundreds and hundreds of farmers to drive their tractors from all over Michigan down to the state capitol in Lansing, Michigan. And they put their tractors all around the Capitol and they put chains around them so that no one could enter. And they protested the terrible laws that were trying to be put in place by these politicians. And in the middle of it, Willie Nelson, the man, the myth, the legend, Willie Nelson called my grandfather. He called my grandfather and he said, "Neil, I heard what you're doing. I want to support you. How can I get involved?" And my grandpa, being my grandpa, he says, "Well, why don't you come on down to Eaton Rapids and hang out with us for a day or two and we'll talk. I'll let you know what we're doing, why we're doing it." Willie Nelson stayed with my grandparents for a couple days, got to know them. He put on this amazing concert with a bunch of other country musicians. It was amazing. My grandparents, this story is just so beautiful for me. My grandparents were these reformers, right? These protesters. They were kind of, they were tough as nails, right? They stood up for what they believed. And then my dad's side, we have these stories too, these bridges. My grandfather, World War II, he was Romanian, and he, in the middle of this war, this evil man, Hitler, he says, "I'm going to start pulling soldiers out who don't even want to fight. I'm going to make you fit into my army." My grandfather was taken against his will, put in the army. My grandfather tells these stories about how they gave him guns. He didn't even know how to use the gun. He said he would sit in fields, listening as bullets flew past his ear, watched as friends were shot and killed, praying to God, I don't want to take a life. Every single time putting his gun down and just waiting for the fire to stop, praying that God would get him out of this mess so that he could be with his family again. And then, like many other Germans, he was taken as a prisoner of war. Best thing that could have happened to him. He was brought to America with his family, with nothing. They lived in Wisconsin on a tiny farm. In this tiny little shack, he and his wife and their tiny little newborn. In the middle of freezing cold weather, they had this tiny little wood stove. And he worked hard. For 2 years, worked so hard in that little shed on this tiny little farm. Until finally they moved to Michigan, where he became a bricklayer at a construction company. My grandfather worked hard every single day, gave everything he had. And before he knew it, he was one of the head contractors in Lansing, Michigan. Built some of the Capitol building there that my other grandfather would someday go and protest at. Amazing, right? My grandfather, he was an incredible person. There's stories my grandfather told me of how they built their own home there in Lansing. How there was no basement. There was no basement. So here my grandpa, after working a full day of hard labor, would come home and he dug a basement. He dug a basement with already a house on top. He dug the basement there every single day until he had an actual basement, filled it with concrete. This guy worked so hard. And that is the family stories that were passed down over and over. And stories of my grandfather trying to hold the house together as like rain is gushing in. Those are the stories I was told by my uncles and aunts and my grandfather. He would tell me stories about his father and his great-great-grandfather. These stories, some of them exaggerated. I knew they were exaggerated when I was 10, 12 years old, but I just couldn't help but lean in because they were stories about what it meant to be a warful. What it meant to be a warful, to be tough, strong, to never give up, to be determined, right? I have these stories about my family that get passed down year after year. My kids, I told them about my cousin Troy, who they never got to meet. Troy, who went to Iraq. He was there to serve his country, right? He didn't agree with the war, but he went anyway because his country, he felt, called him. And there in Iraq, he had time and time again, there were these stories of Troy saving people's lives over and over and over again. And then there's a story of Troy in the Humvee driving and seeing ahead of him that the road looked rocky, the road didn't look good, there might be something there. And as he's warning his fellow soldiers, they run over a bomb just as Troy is turning to the back and telling them everyone to sit up in the seat. And as they do, they hit the bomb, and Troy is the one that dies, saving the lives of the people in the Humvee. Those are the stories we pass down, and we don't pass them down for literal history. We pass them down because they're the bridges that bring us to our moral ethics, our identity, our values. That's the deeper value. That's the reason we tell the stories. We tell the stories to remind ourselves that sometimes we move east of Eden, right? Toward the Nimrods, the Babylons, the Canaans, right? Or the Assyrians or the Nineveh, right? Sometimes we move east of Eden and we have to remind ourselves we don't want to move east of Eden. We want to move back west. We want to move back toward home. And the only way sometimes to get back home is to remind ourselves of what's most important. Remind ourselves of the values, the things we should hold on to. And sometimes it takes telling the stories of our falls, our brokenness. There's this fantastic verse in Proverbs 24:16, because I've always liked this verse because it connects with this idea that life is not perfect. That bridge between the two is never easy. right? The bridge is tough. The journey's not easy. It's not perfect. It's filled with pitfalls. It's filled with brokenness. It's just how it is. But if we understand who we are, who we aren't, what our values are, we can do exactly what this verse says. Watch this verse, so good. For the righteous fall 7 times and rises again, but the wicked stumble in times of calamity. The righteous fall over and over again. The idea of 7, it's complete. We constantly fall. It's what we do. But the righteous, the Werfels, right? The Patricks, the Hazards, right? The Oswalds, we get back up. We get back up. We know who we are. We know who we aren't. The Bowens, right? We get back up. Because the bridge is not easy, but it's what we do. And so all of these different patriarchs that are going to be mentioned, Moses, Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of these different individuals that get brought up, these messianic individuals, they're all brought up again to remind us of the difficult journey home, right? The difficult journey where we make lots of mistakes, lots of brokenness. None of these characters are going to do it perfectly. And what a blessing, what a gift, right? The stories, can you imagine if the stories that were passed down to you were that your family did it perfect every time, right? Grandpa never made one mistake. Ugh, what a painful life to try to live up to. But no, it's the stories, the stories of like brokenness, mistakes, learning from your mistakes. Those are the stories we're drawn into because those are the real stories, right? Those are the things we understand. We understand the righteous fall 7 times. Humanity, we make mistakes, but it's those stories that bridge the gap. It's those stories that remind us of who we are and who we're not to be. Those are the stories. A friend of mine, he found out he'd known his whole life he was adopted, but he never knew who his parents were. And so my friend, he's in his 60s. And a couple of years ago, he said he got this phone call from this woman who claimed to be his sister, his biological sister. She said, "Look, I've been trying to track you down for years and years." And so she lived all the way in St. Louis. And so he got on a plane and he flew to where she was. And they met in this tiny little restaurant. And of course, he's not interested in the superfluous questions. How was your day? How was your week? What kind of car do you have? Those kind of questions. Not at all. He wanted to know the stories. He wanted to know about the paths on the bridge, the characters. Tell me about mom and dad. Tell me about our family history, the stories. Give me the fish stories. Give me whatever you have. And so she told him story after story, and he just kept eating it up. He had formed an identity, of course, right? He's 60. He formed an identity, but hearing the stories helped him understand, yeah, I can see that. That's maybe my determination is more than just, maybe yes, it's been cemented here, it's grown here, but maybe I even had it in me before, right? And at the end of the conversation, after telling the stories, she looked at him and she said, "You know what? You have dad's eyes." Said, you have mom's personality. And when he heard that for the first time, he said all the stories were causing him to laugh and all these moments, but he said when he heard that, you have dad's eyes, these kind eyes, and you have mom's bubbly personality. He said he wept like a baby because sometimes we need to be reminded of our stories. Sometimes we need to be reminded of our value, right? We need to be reminded of where we've been, where we're going. We need those stories. We need those stories. We need to be reminded of what happens on that bridge, who the characters were, where we've been, where we're going, the mistakes we've made. Those stories are the glue that holds us together. And this is chapter 10 for Israel. It's this moment where they're reminded, hey, there's this bridge. There are these people, these characters that play a big part. And we're about to step in and read about these individuals, who, of course, are a reminder of who we are, who we aren't, where we're heading, where we shouldn't be heading. It's all there. And it's beautiful once you understand the context and the purpose. That was a lot of fun. So how do we apply this, right? Like, what do we do with this? Here's what I want to do today. All of us have pasts, right? We all have histories. We all have these families with these different stories and all of it. How do we connect to our past? Well, here's some ideas from my friend that he said really worked for him. Number one, he said, ask your living elders to share their memories. And this doesn't always even have to be like a family member. Here's the thing about the old. There's a syndrome called the invisible syndrome. And this is for old people. Elderly people oftentimes begin to feel invisible in culture because the young don't want to be reminded of their final days. And so what'll happen is many times the elderly are ignored, they're pushed aside. And yet, here's the thing, the Israelites understood the elderly. They're the ones that hold the most wisdom. They're the ones that they would beg to sit around the campfire and tell the stories. We don't do that in our culture. But what if we did? Right? What if we sat around and said, hey, tell me these firsthand accounts of what it was like to do this and this? What if nursing homes were always packed with people who wanted to hear stories? Yeah, right? Number two, become a historian. No, I don't mean go to school, get your history degree. No, I mean be someone with like this historian kind of mindset. Always digging, collecting family pictures, collecting the stories, putting it all together. Man, I have this my uncle, historian to the core. And I had this on my bookshelf. My grandpa carried this around everywhere he went on jobs. This thermos, and he dropped it once, and the handle broke. And so my uncle, he found this thermos, and I remember my grandpa using this thermos over and over again all throughout his life. And he instead of buying a new thermos with a better handle, he just like put together one with some. Oh, Leo, what is this? I don't even know what these are called. Yeah, whatever. He used these things just to make it. And my uncle did all this research into where my grandpa was, and he put this little plaque together. Henry's undefeatable spirit is represented by the Aladdin Stanley thermos, right? Historians, they're always looking for the things, the stories, the mementos. That's what they do. And so what if you had that same mindset of, I want to put together the albums, right? Maybe you do it digital, I don't know, but you're constantly collecting the stories and the memories because those things are important, and that's what you can pass down to the future generations. Become a historian. Another point, visit places. My uncle, when he was doing the study over my grandpa Henry, he actually went to Romania. He actually got to see where he grew up, right? Met some old family members he didn't even know existed. Stayed at some of their houses. It's what we do. It gives you perspective on the past. And this is why many people, when they study the Bible, they'll go to Jerusalem, right? Even though Jerusalem is very different than it was in the first century, but they'll go there just to get an idea, a picture, right, of these stories, just to be grounded in it. Yeah, so good. And the last one, once you get these stories, once you have some of these stories, share them. Share these stories. It's the only way they're going to be passed down. Because here's the thing, you and I are the bridge. You and I are the bridge that's going to bring those values, those ethics, those stories. We are the ones that are going to pass those down to the future generations. If we don't, those stories are lost. They're lost in Babylon. And before you know it, those stories of triumph, resilience, those stories are lost. And so I think it's so important right now to share those stories. Be the bridge for the future generations. Everyone, thank you so much. That was so much fun. I really enjoyed that time. As always, please consider giving to ethos-church.org/donate. Again, that's a tax-deductible donation. If you want to join us once or twice a month, we come together and we discuss things as a community online. And so we get people from all over the states coming together, discussing profoundly interesting ideas. The Bible is usually the center of all the discussion. It is so fun. And as always, look at that subscribe button, hit it, share it with as many people as you can. We'd really this year like to start growing the YouTube channel more. As other elements have grown, we'd like to see this one grow too. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Take care, and we'll see you next week as we delve into chapter 11 of Genesis and the Tower of Babel. See ya.